Hello everyone. So welcome to the new lecture series on modern Indian history. So today we are actually speaking about two topics within one lecture, and these two topics had huge impacts on the Indian population. We had discussed also in between these aspects about the economic policies and the educational policies of the British government in India. But then we are thinking of combining both these because you see that both these policies had actually affected the Indian society so much that Indians started resisting against the British colonial rule through the nationalist movement. It directly affected their day-to-day life. That's why they were very much frustrated and they resisted. So we are trying to combine both these in one lecture series, and there have been so many questions, previous year question papers that repeatedly were being asked on economic and educational policies of the British in India in the prelims questions on UPSC. So we will start with the slides. So what are the focus areas of this presentation? So basically it is that how colonial economic and education policies were designed to serve British imperial interests. So we had already discussed it in a kind of, we have touched upon these aspects of education and economy, but then whose interests it served actually ultimately? It had served the British interests, but then we will actually list out some of the factors which we already discussed along with some other factors that were not yet discussed. So in fact, it really didn't serve the Indian interest, but it ultimately served the British interest. This is what we will be answering. I'm posing this question, how it generated the nationalist sentiment, how it created that intellectual conditions, because it's not just the political, but the intellectual. Like you see, for instance, a person like Dadabhai Naoroji, N.G. Ranade, who are actually intellectually intervening. They are writing books criticizing the economic policies of the British rule. So you see that the intellectual foundations of Indian nationalism are also laid because of these educational and economic policies of the British colonial state. And in fact, you can see that the economic policy created the grievances, that people were very much affected by these policies. And education policy, in fact, we had discussed how the colonial state had created, they thought of creating a loyal, rule-abiding Indian subjects by educating them, but instead they became very much disloyal and they became the nationalists. So in fact, we will be speaking about the long-term impacts of these two policies on Indian history. In a different way, we will speak about the colonial economic policies. So in this presentation, I have listed three major phases of the colonial economic policy. The first one is the mercantilist phase of the British colonial state. It is from 1757 to 1813. So what is mercantilist phase? So mercantilist phase is nothing but looting and plundering. In simple words, it is called as the plunder phase. So what is the plunder phase? Because we had discussed that this was the time when the English East India Company was ruling India, and English East India Company had started as a trading company, and they also created their own military setup through which they were actually conquering various territories of India. And remember that this is the phase, 1757 is the year when the Battle of Plassey had happened, and it was the time when they actually acquired slow political power, and they had their own military power through which they could conquer Bengal, and they also conducted the Carnatic Wars against the French. And the strong military phase was one of the major aspects of the mercantilist phase, and through that military power, they're actually controlling the various territories in India, and they're looting the wealth, they're plundering the wealth of India, and through that they're becoming more and more superior. So first is mercantilist phase, second is free trade or industrial capitalism phase. It is from 1813 to 1860. So now the policy of the English colonial state is also changing. And remember that 1813 is a significant year in Indian history, because this is the year when the Charter Act is being passed. And through Charter Act, what is the most significant step that the colonial state is taking is that not the colonial state, the home country Britain is taking the policy, the significant policy is that now the trade is being opened to private parties. So until then, the monopoly was vested with the English East India Company. During 1813, the trade is getting open to all the private traders. There are no restrictions in trade. So, which means what? More British players are entering in India and exploiting in India, and this is also the phase where industries are growing in Britain. And how the industries are growing in Britain is by deindustrializing in India, industries are growing in Britain. So this is the second phase which starts from the Charter Act. It starts from 1813, and the third phase is the finance capitalism phase. The finance capitalism phase actually starts from the 1860s. And what happens from the 1860s is that these British private parties also, this is also the time when the power is becoming shifted from English East India Company to the British Crown. And you see that the private parties, the British private parties, they're actually investing in railways, plantations, they're turning into an investment based state, and which is even leading to more and more distress to the Indian population. So when you talk about the economic policies of the British colonial state, you can divide it into these three phases largely, and these are happening step by step. So in fact, the most common thing that happened across these three successive stages of British colonial economic policy is that the Indian surplus is getting transferred from India to Britain, which is known as the drain of wealth, which was actually propagated by the grand old man of India, who is Dadabhai Naoroji. So he had written a treatise known as Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. The title itself is very interesting, that it is un-British, very much not becoming of the British tradition of liberty, equality, justice, and it is combined with poverty. So it's a very powerful title that Dadabhai Naoroji coined, and this was a fierce resistance, intellectual criticism of the British economic policies. So in fact, he had spoken about this idea of drain of wealth, which was consistent in these three phases of the economic policies of the British state. And you see that we have spoken about deindustrialization and commercialization. Especially from the second phase, what we see is that India is getting deindustrialized, and Indian agriculture and Indian land is becoming excessively commercialized. So these things you need to remember. So Dadabhai Naoroji actually proposed this theory of drain of wealth first in 1867. And what did he actually speak about the drain of wealth in 1867 is that there is something called home charges. So what are the home charges? So home charges means that in Britain there are the military men, the employees. From Indian revenue, the salaries of these military officials as well as the government clerks are paid. Not just salaries, even pensions of these British officials are paid from whatever is deposited as tax to the British government by the Indian subjects. So Dadabhai Naoroji is saying that there is a kind of systematic looting that is there during the process of drain of wealth. When it comes to the first phase, it is open looting that the British is doing. By killing people, they are actually looting the money, capturing the territory. But when it comes to the free trade phase, you see a systematic kind of draining of wealth that the British is doing in Indian soil. And the most important manifestation of it is the home charges. How Indian subjects are paying for the salaries and pensions of the British officials way back in Britain. That is one form. Next one is India consistently exported than it imported. In fact, Indians were the ones who exported large amounts of raw materials such as jute, cotton and other commodities to Britain, and it actually imported less amount of raw materials and imported more amount of manufactured goods. So in that sense, Indian wealth in the form of agricultural produce is getting directly looted from the Indian soil by the British. Profits and dividends, so basically the profits are getting reaped by the British and Indians are not getting anything out of it. And in fact, railway also, you see that for the construction of railway, Indians had to pay the lion's share of revenue for constructing railways, which ultimately served the British purpose. So these points we need to remember when Dadabhai Naoroji had spoken about drain of wealth. So deindustrialization we will emphasize some more. We'll go a bit deeper into the idea of deindustrialization. So what were the products that the British colonial state, especially the industrial products that the British colonial state actually deindustrialized? So one is Dhaka muslin. Muslin is a cloth actually which is used for making saris and other cloths. Then of course Gujarat textiles and metal goods. So in fact in Dhaka, which is in present day Bangladesh, and Murshidabad, which is in present day West Bengal, muslin is naturally grown product. And you see that the Indian weavers, Indian spinners were actually getting profits, were actually self-sufficient through these products even during the Mughal period. But with the coming of the English colonial state, you see that Indian industries are systematically debunked, and you see the British industries getting more prominence. Their products, such as the Lancashire mills, their products are getting sold at a cheaper rate, and you see these weavers and spinners struggling because everybody is going for the British made final products, and it is systematically ruining the lives and conditions, the livelihoods of these weavers who were the traditional occupation, who actually considered weaving as their traditional occupation. So their livelihood is getting destroyed by this aspect of deindustrialization. And one important thing that you need to remember is that the British manufactured textiles, whatever came as the finished products from Britain in the form of clothes, they were allowed into India without any duties. Very important point. So 1813 is the year, as I told you, where India is getting opened up to the free traders in Britain, and this is the same year when the British made goods are passed into India. So Britain doesn't have to pay any duties or any money or any tariffs when it enters India. So it means that these goods can enter India freely. So this is a kind of economic imperialism that the British were doing in India. And it is starting from the age of 1813, the free trade reign, the free trade era. And not just that, when Indian textiles are getting exported to Britain, there are huge number of tariffs that are being levied. This is also a contrast. So when Indians have to export to Britain, they have to pay more tariffs, so that completely crushing the Indian industries. So this is also the context where this economic nationalism, the idea of Swadeshi and all is rising up much later during the extremist phase and the Gandhian phase. Owning yourself as an Indian, that is getting destroyed during the phase of deindustrialization. So obviously free trade ideology had served British interests. So this is like a visual representation. So if you see these two gentlemen, they are Britishers, and then if you see the dressing style of these Indians, they are basically Indians. So there is a kind of communication that is happening between the Britishers as well as the Indians, and this is like a depiction of a traditional Indian village, and you see that these Indians are wearing traditional dresses, and in fact these traditional dresses are becoming completely obsolete. They are completely destroyed with the coming of the British colonialism and British industrial revolution. So I thought of sharing this painting with you. And one significant thing that we see is that this set of population, who are the Indians who are producing these muslin, the cotton and the metal goods, their profits are declining so much, and you see that there is a growth in the population of farmers. So Indian industries which are existing until now are completely getting destroyed, and many of these industrialists, for the sake of livelihood and sustenance, are turning into agriculture. So you see that the population of agriculturalists are growing in India during that time, and this is a direct result of the policy of deindustrialization. And basically they were artisans, this artisanal community who were basically not just weavers but other sort of small scale industries were there. They were completely debarred of their occupations and they had to turn to agriculture. And this is how the process of deindustrialization is happening in India. So this is a depiction of two weavers in India, they are actually weaving their own cloths. So basically they are gold embroiderers. So basically in clothes, they give the embroidery work. So you have so many traditional occupations in India which are completely destroyed with the coming of the industrialization of Britain. And this is just like a pictorial depiction of some weavers in India who held their own occupation on a generational basis. So as I told you, many of them are turning into agriculture because of this deindustrialization. And in the field of agriculture, of course, the most important thing is the land revenue. We had discussed about land revenue partially. So the very extractive land revenue policies of the British colonial state even made the conditions of peasants severe and worse. And you see that this was like a more direct instrument of revenue extraction, because as I told you in some of the other lecture series, with the coming of the British colonial state, land is becoming excessively commercialized, land is becoming a commodity, which was not the case beforehand, and peasants were forced to cultivate cash crops such as jute, indigo, cotton and other commodities which don't allow them to sustain. And the reason for forcing the peasants to cultivate cash crops is because they had to pay huge revenue to the colonial state. So in fact, they also had to pay, they had to borrow money from the money lenders, and they had to lend them back the money. They were indebted to the money lenders. And one interesting thing, or one very crucial thing that we haven't mentioned about, is famines, the prevalence of famines. This is also connected to an economic impact of the British colonial policy. So India had witnessed consistent famines during the rule of the British colonial state, right? So this is something that we have not discussed in our previous lecture series. So this is just a pictorial depiction of some women workers, traditional workers in India in much later period. This is a photograph of that. So famines, we'll come to famines. So famines were like a phenomenon in India during the British colonial period. In fact, it started from the 1770 in Bengal, where almost 1/3 of Bengal's population were killed. And this was the time when Warren Hastings was the Governor General of India. And it is in this context that during 1796, they passed the permanent settlement in India. They thought that permanent settlement could redress the grievances or could redress the problems that were wrought by the economic or land revenue policies of the British colonial state. So famines can be directly connected to the land revenue based extraction that was there, because famines are not naturally made, famines are artificially made. It is a human made disaster where humans are starved to death due to the extractive revenue policies of the British colonial state, combined with the exploitation of the zamindars or the landlords and the exploitation by the money lenders. The common farmers are not even able to eat their food, which is resulting in malnutrition and starvation. So it is like a man-made disaster, man-made murder, in fact, we can call. And it was during Dalhousie's administration that certain land revenue system was very much extractive. And you see continuous famines happening in different areas of India. In the region of Deccan, especially Bombay and Madras presidency, during 1876 to 78, different districts had experienced a series of famines. And even during 1896 and 97 and 1899 and 1900 also, there were repeated famines. So famines are not just connected to the weather conditions, drought, it is also connected to human conditions or human factors. As I told you, always the colonial state have this carrot and stick policy. So even though they create the conditions of famine where there is human misery or misery for the peasants, they also show the carrot of reports. In fact, in various districts which are famine affected, they actually send some colonial officials to survey those lands, and they made reports to satisfy the subjects. However, in 1880 and 1898, there were some famine commissions that were there. But then again, you see that there were the free traders, the British traders, who actually were investing more and more in India, who were against this policy. So in fact, the larger structure of free trade is connected to famine also. It is not just land revenue extraction. Land revenue extraction is one factor, but it is also connected to the larger free trade system that is operating in the British world. Because whatever commodity is being cultivated here, be it cotton, be it indigo, or be it any other product, they are getting transported or exported to Britain, and there will be free traders in Britain. So these free traders in Britain objected to the Famine Commission report. They thought that it is restricting the interests of these free traders. So in fact, these free traders were very much complicit. They were facilitating these famine conditions, and this means that they were very much inhuman towards the lives of Indians. So in fact, the Free Traders Act resisted against this government intervention, and in fact they were socially produced catastrophes. Actually, the free traders thought that, because the idea of free trade is what? The idea of free trade means the colonial government won't interfere in, there is no control. Like today we have the liberalization, privatization, globalization, where the state doesn't interfere in market affairs. Market has its own independence to engage in trade. There are no protocols, no guidelines. So the same situation happened there. So the free traders were very much desperate that the government is intervening highly through these famine commission reports. And famines were socially produced, not a natural disaster or naturally made. And in fact, it is rooted in poverty, landlessness, which are connected to the larger economic policies of the British colonial state, and deliberate policy choices. Remember, this is very powerful, deliberate policy choices. So it is a policy failure which is resulting in famines. And in fact, the nationalists had critiqued the prevalence of famines also, and it was connected to the colonial revenue policies. And in fact, famines, the prevalence of famines became one of the major tools that the nationalists actually took to resist against the British colonial state. So even though India was deindustrialized, so we have to think in such a way, when Britain was trying to deindustrialize India, Indians were simultaneously trying to industrialize itself. So it is like Britain is forcing India to deindustrialize, but India is resisting it by industrializing itself. And its examples can be seen from 1854, where in Bombay, you see certain Indians starting their own textile mills. So Indians are creating their own textile mills. It is serving as a point of resistance against the deindustrialization policy of the British colonial state. And you have the famous example of Jamshedji Tata. So the famous company called Tata, which is there even today, was started in Jamshedpur in 1907. The first company that they started is the Tata Iron and Steel Company, TISCO, in 1907. So this is like an Indian entrepreneurial startup which was started in India, and this was like a fierce resistance to the policy of deindustrialization, because it was founded without any British support. Indians themselves created their own industries. And in fact, this is also the time when the Swadeshi movement was becoming more and more popular. And over a period of time, you see many Indian industrialists and capitalists setting up their own factories and their own industries, which actually served as a resistance to the British colonial rule. And even during Gandhian phase, you see that Gandhi himself went to the streets and appealed to the industrialists and capitalists to fund the Indian national movement against the British colonial state. And you see that many of these Indian industrialists and capitalists actually supported Gandhi in fighting against the colonial government. So you see that Indian industrialization is working against the deindustrialized policy of the British colonial state. So this is a kind of Indian industrial nationalism that is happening in India. Not just that, there were coal and jute industries that were established in Bengal, because Bengal is also a land of jute, and it was largely British owned or managed. But then there were also Indians who tried to start these companies. And in fact, the early Indian industrialization is considered as an achievement against the colonial exploitation, colonial economic drain. So this thing we need to remember. So there was a scholar called M.G. Ranade. He was also a nationalist. He was an intellectual who actually critiqued the economic foundations of British nationalism. He actually pitched for many Indians to start their own industries, to invest in capital, start their own companies. And in fact, he vouched for state also must assist in the industrialization process. and he was against the huge tariffs that Indians had to pay when they export commodities to Britain. So he vouched for protective tariffs and government investment in agriculture and industry. So he vouched for more government intervention, and also he encouraged Indians to start their own industries. And this economic criticism was actually connected to the larger nationalist movement that was there. So along with Dadabhai Naoroji, we need to speak about M.G. Ranade, and even Gopalakrishna Gokhale, who was a moderate nationalist, also had spoken about the exploitative policies of the British colonial state. So in fact, you see these people, these nationalists critiquing the British economic policies. It's also known as economic nationalism, right? We will go to the next phase of our presentation, and we have discussed about the educational policy of the British colonial state, because as I told you, economic policies created grievances among the public. Educational policies created the growth of a nationalistic community. Even M.G. Ranade, Dadabhai Naoroji and Gopalakrishna Gokhale were products of British education. But when it comes to the pre-colonial method of education, before the British colonial state came, there were a variety of educational systems in India. There were the Pathshalas, there were the madrasas. So in madrasas, there was this religious learning that was being taught. And in madrasas were mostly catering to Quranic learning. And in Pathshalas, they taught the Vedas. And they actually had Gurukul system where the Guru and the Chelas would be there, who the Guru would be teaching knowledge to the Chelas. So this is how the Indian knowledge system had followed from the pre-colonial period, and it was more decentralized, and the languages, the most important languages that were being taught were Arabic and Sanskrit. Also Persian was also being taught. The British actually created a myth that India was educationally backward, and they are the ones who are actually very progressive when it comes to education. Especially this was more prevalent from the time of Thomas Babington Macaulay, who actually proposed this idea of English education for all people. Until then, the colonial state had in fact preserved the traditional knowledge systems which were based on Sanskrit, Arabic and Persian learning. And when the colonial state came, especially after the time of Thomas Babington Macaulay, they didn't fund for indigenous knowledge system, indigenous education. It was completely curtailed. In fact, we see the prevalence of more English institutions. So even though we had discussed about this Anglicist position, because you see that in the beginning of the colonial state, they had to preserve the traditional knowledge systems of India. They actually translated many books which were written in Sanskrit into English and other languages. They even preserved certain holy books in Islamic tradition as well as Hindu tradition during the earlier phase. But from 1834, you have the phase of Lord Macaulay, where English is becoming the major language of communication even in schools and universities. And there is something called Wood's Dispatch we discussed. Charles Wood was a colonial official who spoke about different levels of learning. There is the primary education, the higher secondary education, the higher education, the higher school level education, then the college level, the university level. So in that sense, this kind of hierarchy in English education was actually proposed by Charles Wood. And from the mid-19th century, that is from 1850s onwards, especially after during Dalhousie's time, lots of universities were started in the presidencies of Madras, Bombay and Calcutta. So in fact, you see the spread of English education through universities. And this is a picture of a teacher teaching students. In fact, this is coming from a very modern kind of education, even though they are wearing traditional dress. It is not from a Pathshala or like a madrasa, but it means that Indians got adapted to the English education much later. And one interesting thing that we need to remember is the role of missionaries, which I have not mentioned here, because missionaries, you see that from 1850s onwards, the English colonial state is giving space for missionaries to start private schools, aided schools in a larger way, through which education is being spread in a much larger way. So this is the beginning of it is from the Charter Act. You remember that from the Charter Act onwards of 1813, they are asking missionaries to come to India, and they are asking to spread education. And this time during the mid-18th, 19th century, education is being given free rein by the colonial state to the missionaries. And just one decade before, we see that in some provinces, slavery is getting abolished, and there were huge interventions by the missionaries to abolish slavery. And from the 1850s, missionaries are also starting schools and colleges, and many of the lower caste communities who were actually erstwhile slaves are being given education. So education also had played a transformative role under colonialism, even though it served their vested interests. So it was mainly because of the missionaries that this social change or reform happened. Coming to 1904, under Lord Curzon, there was something called Indian Universities Act. So Lord Curzon had kind of controlled the Indian universities. There was more state intervention in the Indian universities during that time. Indian universities couldn't be autonomous. So this is very significant in the context of the rise of the Swadeshi movement or the upsurge of extremist movement, along with the idea of partitioning Bengal. This also became a hue and cry among the extremists to raise their voice against the British colonial state. So we need to remember this aspect also when it comes to the educational policy. And in fact, there was more resistance from the nationalists against this control that were being done by the colonial state on Indian education, especially Indian universities. So we need to remember this. And they gave more importance to university education. Under the Indian Universities Act, the primary education was completely set aside. So all throughout the interventions by the English colonial state in the education system, there was not much importance given to the schooling system, but more importance was given to the higher education system. Even though missionaries started their own schools, still the schools were very much underfunded. The primary schools were not up to the mark when you compare with the universities. It served two purposes. There were good benefits also, because you see lots of lower caste communities getting education. But then it had a very drastic consequences also, because the funding for traditional education reduced and the funding for primary education also reduced. So it is important to contextualize the larger economic and educational policies which actually triggered. Why we combine educational and economic policies is because it had impacted the Indian society at large, and it had provoked fierce nationalism among the Indian public against the British colonial state. Not just that, there are some previous year question papers that were asked on this topic, especially in UPSC prelims. We'll get into that. We have touched some aspects of it in our previous lecture series. So there are three statements given. This came in UPSC prelims in 2019. There are three statements. One is Lord Macaulay's Minute on Education advocated imparting education in English. Yes, Macaulay had advocated imparting education in English, unlike the earlier Anglicist phase where there was an emphasis to preserve the traditional languages of India. The second statement is Wood's Dispatch is also known as the Magna Carta of English education in India. This is something we didn't touch upon. It is actually known as the Magna Carta of English education in India. That is true. So the second statement is also correct. The third statement is the Charter Act of 1813, about which we discussed, had made a provision for the introduction of English education in India. In fact, the Charter Act had officially made the proposal to bring English education in India. During the time of Macaulay, it became more popular. That is the difference. But officially, the proposition was to impart English education during Charter Act in 1813. So these three statements are correct. In 2017 paper, there was a question that was based on the economic policy. So it was based on the land revenue system, about which we also discussed, along with drain of wealth. So it's like a match the following kind of, whether it is matching with the actual. So there is a policy mentioned and associated feature. Raitwari system made the zamindar the proprietor of the land. It is absolutely false. It never made zamindar owner of the land, was the peasant. So first match is wrong. Second is permanent settlement, high assessment and absence of peasants' ownership. Yes, in permanent settlement zamindari system, there was no ownership by the peasants. Ownership was vested with the zamindars or the landlords. So that match is correct. Second is correct. The third one is Mahalwari system. Village community was treated as the landlord. Absolutely correct. So the third match is correct. The fourth is export of capital from India to Britain. No, it is wrong. Actually, it is export of capital from Britain to India. So drain of wealth, it's not capital that is being exported from India to Britain, it's wealth or the other basic raw materials that are being looted or transported from India to Britain. So that is wrong. In fact, the second and the third matches are correct. So option B consists of second and third match. So that is correct. So these are the previous year question papers that were asked about economic and educational policy of British in India. This is very significant topic because both had its own share of impacts on Indian society and Indian economy, which gave the main root thing that we need to remember is that these two actually created the conditions or facilitated the conditions of the rise of Indian nationalism. Thank you so much.